G'day guys, my name is CJ. Tech season is well underway. We've got the new iPhones, we've got the OnePlus 8T, and there's been a ton of new Google Pixel coverage as well, and it's not going to stop there. I've used the new Google Pixel 5 for the last couple of weeks, and long story short, I'm excited to see where this goes. This is the best of Google, and this is also the review. Let's get started. The original Google Pixel was a really important phone, for me at least. To start with, the OG Pixel was one of the very first phones I reviewed on this channel, so it has a special place in my heart. At the time, smartphone photography was only just starting to become something more than a convenient tool for personal snaps. So when Google brought its AI-assisted computational photography to the masses, it changed the game. Smart HDR, night sight, astrophotography, all of these features are now commonplace in most major flagships now, and it's thanks to the Google Pixel for pushing things forward. But things don't always go the way you want, and whilst Google put its mark down as the photography king, it usually lacked in other areas like design and hardware, often playing second fiddle to almost all other major flagships. Fast forward 4 years, with the Pixel 5, I feel like we've reached the end of one phase in the Pixel life cycle and we're embarking on another. It's no longer the innovator or pioneer of smartphone photography, but instead, the Pixel now in my opinion represents a balanced approach, and it's none more represented than in its price. So that's where we'll start. At similar storage levels, the Pixel 5 undercuts its older brother by 200 Aussie and US dollars. And as seeing as we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, it's a welcome change. But with Google not having any control over the actual components, the cheaper price obviously means having to compromise on certain components. And this is where the thoughtful, balanced approach comes in. And the first area that you'll notice this is in its design. So Google's opted against following the trend of glass sandwiches and instead have gone for an aluminium shell coated by this unique matte textured paint, all while still preserving wireless charging. Now, according to Google, there's a cutout on the back filled with a resin to enable the current to pass through, and that's great. It's also got IP68 water resistance, so it still ticks a number of boxes that flagship phones would be judged against. It's definitely not as hefty as the Pixel 4 was, but it also doesn't feel cheap, and it balances well in the hand. The paint finish does make it seem a little plasticky or cardboard-like, especially if you scratch or tap your finger on it, but I quite like it, and honestly, most people will probably put a case on it anyway. But on the other hand, because it doesn't feel fragile and you've got that grippier finish, it doesn't feel like it needs a case anyway. And I really appreciate this. It's really liberating being able to hold a phone caseless and not stressing about it if I dropped it. In actual fact, I did drop it whilst filming this video, and it came out largely unscathed. I can't say the same fully for the screen, but we'll get to that soon. Otherwise, the Pixel 5 has gone for metal buttons that aren't quite as clicky and tactile as the plastic ones that you see on the 4As, which is a shame, but still tactile enough nonetheless. And then you've also got the return of the fingerprint reader in the best and most natural position, which I really love. It works reliably and fast, and in a world where masks are now part of life and Face Unlock doesn't work, it makes a huge difference. And that's actually a perfect segue into the next area I'll talk about, which is Face Unlock, or the lack thereof. Now, if there was a year to drop the motion sense feature, it's 2020. And whilst I'm gonna miss how quick and reliable Face Unlock was, the positives you get with a full screen display far outweigh the negatives. So the screen is a flat, hole punch, edge-to-edge 1080p OLED screen with a 90Hz refresh rate. And this is another example of the thoughtful, balanced approach that Google's made. Now, I still maintain that the jump from 60 to 90Hz is far more significant than going from 90 to 120. Now, of course, us spec nerds will always want the best, but the majority of people don't care, or they probably don't even know the difference between 60, 90, and 100, or they don't really notice it. So instead of opting for 120Hz like in the top flagships, the 90Hz refresh rate still gives us a smooth enough experience, also whilst consuming less battery, which is really important. Now of course the screen doesn't get as bright as the Samsungs or iPhones, but for all intents and purposes, it still looks great, and using it I've been really happy with it. Now I also love how clean the Pixel 5 looks with its uniform bezels. I showed the phones to loved ones, and it always received comments of saying how nice it looks, followed by questions of, man, why can't the iPhone have a screen like this? High praise indeed. But these clean lines do come at a slight cost. Now if you look closely, there's no front speaker grille, and that's because it houses a panel audio module where the display itself vibrates to produce sound. Sounds pretty neat in concept, but in reality, you get a pretty bad sounding stereo speaker setup. The bottom speaker is louder than the front, which makes the soundstage unbalanced, and then the sound coming out of the display lacks bass and definition, and it sounds quite tinny. Using it for calls is okay, but I often wondered where I was supposed to put my ear because there's no focal origin for the sound. And then on top of that, as I mentioned before whilst filming this video, this phone fell from a height of maybe 1 meter onto dirt and grass, and that was enough to leave a few superficial scratches, so you might want to consider getting a screen protector for the phone. But honestly, these issues aren't major deal breakers, and after a few days of solid, constant use, you just get on with your life and you forget about it. Then another detail that you'll probably forget about in the phone is in performance, and I mean that in a good way. Again, cheaper price will lead to compromise, and on paper, the Pixel 5 does opt for a lower powered Snapdragon 765 compared to the beefier 800 series chips that we're used to. But again, we're talking about a balanced approach here. So despite the lower powered chip, the Pixel 5 feels equally smooth, and I haven't had any issues with the overall experience. The only times I've ever really seen the phone struggle is when editing real videos on Instagram with multiple text elements and filters, and I think that's probably more a case of optimization rather than true lack of power. On the flip side, however, the lower powered processor does fix a major downside to last year's Pixel, which is battery life. So the Pixel 5 has a 4000 mAh battery, which by flagship standards is actually still pretty big. It's impressive given the smaller footprint this phone has compared to the Pixel 4, and even more impressive is that it's actually got a bigger battery than the physically larger 4A 5G. And what do you get when you combine a low powered processor with a fat 4000 mAh battery and optimized software? Well, you get really great battery life. At the end of a day, I usually got at least 20 to 30% battery life left, and that's with heavy use. So that's a ton of streaming, social media, mobile data use with 5G, shooting video and photos. It's held on no sweat. I'd go as far as to say that battery life is actually one of the Pixel's strengths now. And on top of that, as we mentioned before, it's still got wireless charging and even bakes in reverse charging too, which is right now considered a flagship feature. So as long as they keep this up and keep pushing the boundaries with battery, we're going to be very happy little Vegemites. Sorry, Aussie reference. Vegemite is terrible. Now for the main strength, and has been for years, the cameras. This year, there's 3 notable things to talk about: the ultra-wide camera, software, and video. So this year, the Pixel 5 sports a 12 megapixel main shooter and 16 megapixel ultra-wide, swapping out the telephoto previously seen on the Pixel 4. So it's still a dual lens system, not triple, but I think opting for the ultra-wide is a good call. The overall field of view isn't as wide as some of the flagships, but what it lacks in field of view, it gains in detail, color reproduction, and distortion. Even in the corners, ultra-wide photos retain a good amount of detail and sharpness, which is something that even flagships still struggle with. I've enjoyed using the ultra-wide so far, and for me, it's definitely the best one out right now. Photos with the standard wide lens are as you'd expect. Across the board, photos are color accurate, contrasty, colorful, and reliable. Night sight works in all focal lengths, including the selfie as well, and overall, as you'd expect, it still works really well. But an even bigger positive with this is that being able to take portrait mode photos with night sight. And I found it pretty reliable in most situations, with the occasional miss with fine details like hair, but in general, it still remains one of the best cameras to do portrait mode. And this extends to selfies as well. As evident by the single hole punch camera, it's a single lens and it's a reliable one too. Hardware wise, it's nothing special. It's got a fixed focus f2.0 lens that shoots at 8 megapixels, but honestly its biggest shortcoming is actually in its field of view. Now with every iteration of Pixel since the Pixel 3, the selfie camera has progressively gotten tighter and tighter, and I'm not a fan. I love the Pixel 3 because it had that second ultra-wide selfie camera, and I didn't mind the Pixel 4 selfie either because it still sat slightly on the wider end. But this year, it's so narrow that it reminds me of old school iPhones. Fitting even just one more person in the frame becomes a crowd, and you can't see the surrounding background. Well, I mean, not that people are going to be congregating in large groups taking selfies this year anyway. But generally, photos taken by this camera can be controversial too. To some, details are almost too well preserved. In a world where phones tend to soften skin even when beauty settings are turned off, the Pixel 5 and indeed all Pixel phones really go the other direction by showing you all the little details on your face, from the little pores to the crow's feet around your eyes. I mean, I personally don't mind this because it means details are preserved and you can make changes after the fact, but some might not like this look. Otherwise, there's still all the usual software camera features from previous Pixels like astrophotography and live exposure controls, all in a more streamlined camera UI, which is really nice. But there is one big caveat, and that's the neural core, or lack of. Now that it's gone, processing photos take longer and take a bigger toll on the phone. And you can tell it's working hard because the phone does get quite toasty when you're shooting for long periods of time. And in these scenarios, it does seem to shorten its battery life too, so keep that in mind. But where this year's Pixels seem to have made the most gains is actually in video. Google finally heard our cries about the Pixel's previously really bad video performance, and it's way different now. The Pixel 5 still shoots up to 4K 60 frames per second with the main sensor, and the ultra-wide is also capable of shooting in 4K as well. There are still some limitations with frame rate choice, and that's a bit of a bummer for people who like to shoot in 24 frame, but there are third-party apps for this. Image quality, however, is much improved compared to the Pixel 4 with better color and detail, and audio fidelity has definitely improved as well. Even selfie videos have taken a step forward in quality, in spite of its narrower field of view.
So this is a test of the selfie camera video. Let me know what you think of the quality in the comment section below, but I will say one thing. It's a little too narrow. Selfie cameras do need to have a wider angle to get more of the scene in, but with this, in order to get a decent amount of the scene, you kind of have to stretch your arms like Inspector Gadget. So,
Stabilization 2 is on point, and there's a few modes baked into the software that's easily accessible. The standard stabilization mode works well in most scenarios and at full resolution. There's a mode set for high intensity movements too, but this steps down resolution and frame rate, and I really wasn't a massive fan of that. Also, the difference in quality in stabilization wasn't really big enough to warrant that trade-off in resolution, so I typically left this mode alone. And then finally, I loved the new cinematic pan feature, which allows you to shoot some pretty nice 4K cinematic scenes, but there do seem to be some issues with regards to the format of these video files, so do keep that in mind. And it plays perfectly fine on the phone, and you can throw it into apps and it works perfectly fine, but actually exporting onto a computer does seem to be a little bit iffy. But otherwise, instead of simply sticking to what it's been good at, Google's turned the Pixel camera into a far more well-rounded and balanced system that I can easily recommend to people for anything camera related, really. Then of course we can't talk about the Pixel without talking about software. So to start with, Pixels are guaranteed to have 3 years of reliable support, and Pixels will always get updates first. So for many, this remains a huge incentive to stick with the Google brand. Plus, a clean, vanilla, unadulterated version of Google Android 11 comes baked into the Pixel 5, and to date, it's still one of my favorites. Though Android 11 isn't without its quirks either, but maybe we'll cover that in another time. Drop us a like if you'd like to see a video talking about Android 11 itself. But in addition to all the great AI-powered things that have already been out, like the Google Assistant, live captioning, or the Recorder app, the Pixel 5 also received some healthy upgrades to its photo software. I've mentioned it briefly in my previous impressions video, but I really love using the new Portrait Light feature. It uses AI to analyze a photo, any photo or portrait and enables you to add a portrait light to the subject that you can actually manipulate in real time. That's just a really cool demo of how far the AI is going, and it gets me excited to see what Google can come up with. So Google's Pixel line of phones have always sat in a slightly bizarre space. Whilst it completely and consistently excelled in photography, it also consistently made some bizarre hardware choices that held it back. But starting with the 3A and now the 4A phones, the 2020 Pixel line, including the 5, represents a new phase in the Google Pixel lifecycle. Instead of aiming for the top with the most expensive components, it's now targeting a more competitive price market instead. So you can buy one of these for 999 Australian dollars with 128 gigs of storage, when other phones can easily go for $1.5 grand. So as a result, the Pixel 5's sharper price makes it way more accessible to far more people. And whilst I miss other random features like the squeeze function, the larger form factor, and the super fast face unlock with gimmicky gestures with motion sense, I feel the word compromises would imply that Google has produced an inferior product at the detriment of the UI experience. And I think that would be really unfair on the Pixel 5. I'd like to think of these differences more as a thoughtful and balanced change rather than compromise, because the philosophy behind this year's Pixels make a lot more practical sense, especially considering what's going on in the world right now. But let me know what you think of this and whether or not you think Google has compromised too much with the Pixel 5 in the comments below. But for me, the thoughtful hardware changes, tasteful design combined with Google's continued optimization of software and computational photography means you get the best of what makes the Pixel great, but at a far more accessible price and equally, if not more, reliable package. Thanks so much for watching the video, guys. Remember to let us know what you think of the Pixel 5 down below. Drop us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, ding the bell icon so you don't miss out. Big thanks again to you guys, and as always, say good day to Mum for me, and stay safe.